The weapon wasn't the problem. It was the way the human handed it over. High Logistics Overseer Veilen stood on the central dais of the Grand Assembly's disarmament citadel, flanked by ceremonial guards of the Valari Directorate and flanked above by the grand banners of the 24 founding species. For 4,000 years, this chamber had been the forge of galactic law. Empires had been dismantled here. Armadas had been ordered into stellar furnaces to maintain the pristine, delicate equilibrium of the Orion Spur. Today, it was humanity's turn. Standing on the cold marble floor below was Commander Jonathan Vance of the United Terran Defense Command. He looked absurdly small in the cavernous space, dressed not in dress whites or decorated armor, but in a plain slate-gray service yard uniform devoid of medals. Commander Vance. Veilen's voice echoed through the acoustic amplifiers, translated simultaneously into 30 dialect streams. You stand before the Grand Conclave to fulfill the mandates of Resolution 9 Omega. Do you understand the terms? I do, Overseer, Vance replied. His voice was steady, dry, almost bored. By unanimous decree, Veilen read, reciting the litany he had memorized over months of tense diplomatic posturing. The Terran Confederation shall surrender all prime activation keys to the Aegis 10 strategic defense grid. You shall stand down the Grand Fleet, dismantle all primary orbital forge networks within Sol and its allied sectors, and submit to a 50-year demilitarization treaty. In exchange, humanity is granted full secondary trade integration and protection under the collective shield of the founding species. Veilen paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle. The logic behind 9 Omega had been absolute. Humanity had entered the galactic stage a mere 50 years prior. In that half-century, they had expanded with terrifying efficiency, developing weapons technology at a pace the Valari Science Directorate classified as biologically implausible. They were chaotic, unpredictable, and possessed a concentration of kinetic firepower. 10,000 orbital platforms and 3,000 heavy capital ships that threatened the delicate balance of power. Place the keys upon the plinth, Veilen commanded. Vance stepped forward. He reached into his coat and produced a heavy, crystalline data link, the master key that would render humanity's orbital defense grid inert and lock their naval shipyards into diagnostic sleep modes. He set it on the polished obsidian plinth. And then Jonathan Vance smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile. It wasn't the tight, muscle-strained grimace of a soldier swallowing defeat, nor the sneer of a covert rebel hiding anger. It was the soft, rested expression of a laborer who had just completed a long, grueling shift and was looking forward to a quiet walk home. Veilen's biomonitors quietly pinged inside his optical implant. The human's heart rate had actually decreased by 4 beats per minute upon laying down the key. His galvanic skin response was entirely baseline. His pupils were steady. His hands, as he stepped back and offered a precise traditional naval bow, were absolute stone. Veilen felt a cold, prickling sensation ripple down his crest scales. He had watched 70 different species sign capitulations, surrender treaties, and disarmament accords over his 2-century career. He knew what defeat looked like. He knew the heavy shoulders of the Alari, the frantic eye flickers of the Keth, the low, subsonic morning hums of the Dreth. Humanity displayed none of it. The key is accepted, Veilen said, forcing his voice to remain flat. The Confederation is officially disarmed. Vance offered a short nod. Thank you, Overseer. If the Council has no further administrative needs, I believe I have a shuttle to catch. 3 weeks later, in the deep sublevels of the intelligence registry, Veilen couldn't sleep. The disarmament citadel was quiet during the third orbital shift, save for the hum of quantum data cores and the soft rustle of archival drapes. Veilen sat at a broad holotable, surrounded by glowing blue projections of shipping manifests, treaty subclauses, and naval registries. "You're still looking at the Terran files?" Veilen looked up as analyst Cora entered the chamber. The young Valari strategist carried 2 bulbs of warm nutrient broth, offering one to her supervisor. Her inner eyelids flickered in mild amusement. "Overseer, the diplomatic corps is still celebrating." The Secretary General gave a 3-hour address yesterday praising the unbloody triumph of conclave diplomacy. "Humanity is compliant." "Look at the negotiation timestamps, Cora," Veilen said, ignoring the broth. He flicked his hand, casting a timeline across the table. "How long did it take the Alari to sign their demilitarization accord 60 years ago?" 3 years, Cora answered instantly. 14 parliamentary deadlocks, 2 border skirmishes, and 3 draft revisions. And the Dreth, 18 months of bitter legal challenges regarding trade compensation. "Now look at the humans." Veilen pointed a long, clawed finger at a single data point. Resolution 9 Omega was delivered to the Terran Embassy on a Tuesday at U8 Citadel Standard Time. It was a 400-page document containing 3,000 legal subclauses, restrictions on warp core outputs, weapon calibers, shipyard tonnage limits, and orbital inspections. He zoomed in on the signature block. They returned it signed at 12:14 the same day, 4 hours and 14 minutes. Cora frowned, her crest flattening slightly. "They didn't request a single amendment?" "Not one," Veilen said softly. "Our translators hadn't even finished cross-referencing the idiom variations in subclause 12B before the Terran ambassador walked into the Secretary General's office, stamped the document, offered a box of Terran sweetbreads as a diplomatic gesture, and left. Perhaps they were terrified," Cora suggested, sitting across from him. The Conclave fleet was postured on their border. A full trade embargo would have starved their outer colonies within a solar year. They knew they couldn't win a war against 24 species. If a species is terrified, their heart rate spikes when they hand over their weapons, Veilen murmured. Their legal teams fight for concessions to save face. They bargain for infrastructure grants, trade exemptions, tax relief. The humans took the baseline offer, the lowest tier of secondary council access, and walked away. He tapped the table, changing the display. "I ran a deep audit on their civilian sector over the last 18 months. Pull up the Terran Commercial Ship Registry." Cora leaned in, her claws clacking against the lightboard interface. Data streams cascaded between them, turning from blue to amber as filtering algorithms passed the numbers. She squinted. That must be a cataloging error. Explain what you see," Veilen instructed. "In the 14 months leading up to the 9 Omega vote, while the Conclave was still debating whether or not to issue the disarmament ultimatum, Terran commercial shipyards experienced a construction surge. They built and registered 42,000 Apex-class heavy cargo vessels. 42,000. Veilen repeated. "A civilian construction capacity increase of 700%. Do you know what an Apex-class vessel is, Cora?" "A long-haul freighter," she read from the technical file. "Modular hull, oversized sublight engine mounts, heavy-duty emergency power routing, reinforced bow plating for asteroid-dense corridors." She stopped. Her voice trailed off. "Keep reading," Veilen said coldly. Cora's inner eyelids blinked rapidly as she cross-referenced the structural schematics. An Apex-class heavy cargo vessel shares 89% of its internal frame architecture, warp core capacity, and auxiliary power routing with a Terran Vanguard-class heavy cruiser. Silence fell over the archival room. "The cargo bays," Cora whispered, her crest now pinned tight against her skull. "The bays are hollowed out. They aren't freighters," Veilen said. "They are warships waiting for organs." The hull plating on the flank modular bays is standard civilian composite, but the underlying mounting brackets are rated for heavy military magnetic locks. The auxiliary power conduits don't lead to refrigeration units. They lead directly to capped, empty weapon hardpoints. "Where are those ships right now?" Cora asked, her voice trembling. "Everywhere," Veilen replied, opening a galactic map. Red dots blossomed across the Orion spur like a quiet outbreak of fever. They are operating along every major trade corridor in Conclave space. They are hauling grain to the Elari, rare ores to the Keth, medical supplies to the Velari core worlds. And do you know who is flying them? He pulled up a crew roster audit. 84% of the registered captains and chief engineers on these freighters are former Terran naval personnel who received early honorable discharges over the last 2 years. Cora stared at the map. "They didn't disarm their fleet. They painted it," Veilen finished. "They took 3,000 military vessels, surrendered them to our custody, fully fueled and clean, and replaced them with 42,000 modular warships disguised as shipping containers, crewed by veterans, sitting in the heart of our home sectors." Veilen did not report his findings to the Grand Assembly. He knew how the political apparatus worked. The Secretary-General was currently authoring a book on the diplomatic resolution of the Terran question. The council members were busy reallocating naval budgets to domestic infrastructure, convinced that the galaxy was entering a golden era of permanent peace. A mid-level logistics overseer presenting an unproven conspiracy theory about civilian cargo ships would be laughed out of the chamber, or worse, quietly reassigned to a weather monitoring station on an ice moon. Instead, Veilen requested a personal meeting with Kasix Soram, the chief logistics officer of the Disarmament Inspectorate. They met in a high-orbit observation lounge overlooking Docking Bay 9, where dozens of surrendered Terran warships sat hooked to conclave umbilical lines. "You're seeing shadows, Veilen," Kasich said, swirling a glass of amber synth wine. The Dreth bureaucrat was rotund, relaxed, and utterly unimpressed by Veilen's file. "We inspected those ships ourselves. Every railgun array on those Vanguard cruisers was unbolted. Every nuclear payload was accounted for and transferred to our secure warhead silos in the Sol outer belt. The hulls in our docking bays are empty shells." "And where are the weapons that were unbolted, Kasich?" Veilen asked, leaning across the small table. "Where did the railguns go?" "To the Terran salvage depots," Kasich snapped, as if explaining basic math to a child. Subclause 14D explicitly permitted humanity to retain uninstalled military hardware for industrial scrap, provided it was stored in non-operational, uncrewed facilities under periodic conclave sensor monitoring. "Show me the sensor logs for salvage belt Delta 9 in the outer Sol system," Veilen said. Kasich sighed, pulled up his personal datapad, and tapped out a query. "Here. Automated buoy reports filed every 48 hours. Energy signatures, 0. Life support signatures, 0. Movement, 0. It's an asteroid belt full of dead metal, Veilen. Run a cross-analysis of Terran civilian mining tug activity near Delta 9 over the past 6 months." Veilen counted. Kasix grumbled, tapping the screen again. A list of flight logs appeared. He scanned them, then stopped. He tapped again. "What is it?" Veilen asked. "Mining tugs," Kasix muttered, his brow furrowing. "They've been making regular stops at Delta 9. Hundreds of trips. Why would mining tugs visit a dead scrapyard?" "The logs say, preventative rust maintenance," Kasix read. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly. "Preventative maintenance on scraped railguns?" "They didn't scrap them," Veilen said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "They greased them. They put them in pressurized automated storage containers fitted with quick-release magnetic clamps. They didn't hide their weapons after we passed 9 Omega, Kasix. They hid their weapons 2 years before we even voted on it." Kasix set his wineglass down with a sharp clink. How could they know? The draft for 9 Omega was classified at the highest conclave security level. It was debated in closed sessions. "Because they didn't need to steal our files," Veilen said grimly. "They looked at us. They saw a 1,000-year-old bureaucracy that reacts to threat profiles with administrative containment. They knew that the moment their fleet surpassed a certain tonnage, our political machinery would inevitably produce a disarmament mandate, so they didn't build a fleet to fight the mandate. They built a fleet that could survive being dismantled." "We have to notify the Secretary General," Kasix breathed, reaching for his communicator. "And tell him what?" Veilen asked, placing a heavy hand over Kasix's wrist. "That humanity is legally complying with every letter of the treaty, that they haven't violated a single clause. If we accuse them now, they will point to our own inspection reports. They will call us paranoid. And while we debate it in committee, 42,000 heavy freighters will continue sitting right outside our homeworlds." Kasix swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" "We wait," Veilen said, looking out the glass window at the dark, silent hulls of the human warships docked below. "We wait, and we pray that whoever humanity built this trap for isn't us." The answer to Veilen's question arrived 4 months later. It did not come from within the conclave. It came from the dark void beyond the Perseus arm. The first indication was the complete loss of communications with the Keth Frontier Patrol. 3 border outposts simply ceased broadcasting within 4 minutes of each other. Before the Conclave Defense Staff could dispatch an investigative task force, the deep space sensor arrays along the rim registered a massive localized gravimetric distortion. The Kraken hegemony had arrived. They were not a species known to conclave diplomats, save for old, vague horror stories recorded by deep-range automated scouts. The Kraken were a cold, predatory empire, an ancient, nomadic war fleet that moved from sector to sector, harvesting orbital infrastructure, stripping worlds of refined metals, and glassing planetary populations to prevent organized resistance. They did not send emissaries. They did not broadcast demands. Their vanguard fleet, 80 massive, brutalist dreadnoughts, each 3 times the size of a conclave flagship, accompanied by thousands of swarming strike craft, dropped out of warp directly inside the outer Keth system. The Conclave's response was an immediate catastrophic failure. The Grand Fleet, built for slow, majestic peacekeeping operations and high-visibility diplomatic deterrence, was spread thin across 24 sectors. The chain of command was choked by bureaucratic protocol. Before the Assembly could even vote to declare an emergency defense state, the Kraken dreadnoughts had shattered the Keth Regional Defense Brigade, turned 3 orbital shipyards to floating slag, and locked down the primary hyperspace relay corridor, leading directly into the Conclave core worlds. By day 3 of the invasion, panic gripped the disarmament citadel. The Central Assembly Chamber was a chorus of screaming delegates. The Keth representative was on his knees, weeping openly as holofeeds displayed the burning orbital habitats of his homeworld. The Elari delegate was frantically demanding that the Grand Fleet abandon its defensive posts along the border to shield their central trade hubs. High Overseer Veilen stood at the back of the chamber, watching the chaos unfold. Beside him stood Delegate First Class Mir Levasquez, humanity's sole representative present. She wore her dark blue, single-striped diplomatic uniform. She had no aides, no advisors, no security detail. She stood calmly, her arms folded behind her back, watching the alien representatives scream at one another like terrified children in a burning house. Veilen stepped closer to her. "You aren't surprised," he said softly. Levasquez didn't look at him. "Our long-range deep space arrays in the Oort cloud picked up Kraken scout probe telemetry 26 months ago," she said, her voice entirely flat. "We forwarded the raw data to the Conclave Security Subcommittee. Do you know what they filed it under?" Veilen closed his eyes. Terran threat exaggeration designed to justify military budget expansion. "Precisely," Levasquez said. She finally turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his. "Your intelligence apparatus assumed we were manufacturing a boogeyman so we could build more Vanguard cruisers. They couldn't imagine a species collecting data simply because space is dangerous and dark. And so you let Resolution 9 Omega pass," Veilen realized, the final pieces of the grand, terrifying puzzle sliding into place in his mind. "You knew the Council would disarm you. You knew we would force you to hand over your keys. If we had fought the resolution," Levasquez said gently, "the Conclave would have declared us a rogue threat. You would have imposed blockades, fractured your own economy, and mobilized your fleet against us. And when the Kraken arrived today, they would have found 25 shattered, exhausted species fighting among their own ashes." She looked back at the screaming assembly floor. "We needed you whole," she whispered. "We needed the Conclave to remain stable, arrogant, and unified right up until the second the real threat hit the wall. Because an arrogant empire still maintains its roads." Veilen felt a chill run through his entire circulatory system. "Where is Admiral Chen?" "She's in the station's lower promenade," Levasquez said, checking a simple analog watch on her wrist. "Drinking tea, waiting for your Secretary General to finish crying." The emergency meeting was not held in the Grand Assembly floor. It was held in the small, hardened bunker beneath the Citadel, the strategic war room reserved for existential crises. Secretary General Orthmos sat at the head of the obsidian table, his pale fur matted with sweat, his fingers twitching uncontrollably. Around the table sat the high commanders of the 5 largest founding species. And sitting at the far end, looking perfectly comfortable, was Admiral Yara Chen. "The Kraken fleet will reach the central spur relay within 36 hours, Orthmos stammered, pointing a trembling claw at the tactical map. "Our Grand Fleet reserves cannot assemble in strength for at least 6 days. The central systems are entirely undefended. If they take the relay, the entire conclave collapses." He looked around the table, desperate for answers. The commanders stared at their boots. The Valari admiral muttered something about defensive lines 3 sectors back, effectively abandoning 400 billion citizens to the Kraken harvest. Veilen stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway. Secretary General, Veilen called out. Orth Moss looked up, his eyes bloodshot. Not now, Overseer. We are calculating strategic retreat vectors. Ask her, Veilen said. Pointing directly at Chen, the room fell silent. What? Orth Moss blinked. Ask Admiral Chen why the human civilian freighters currently docked in the central relay sector have been running engine diagnostics for 48 hours, Veilen said, his voice ringing crisp and clear against the metallic walls. Ask her why 42,000 Terran cargo vessels across the spur have spent the last 3 days topping off their fuel reserves at their own expense. Orth Moss stared at Chen.
Admiral?
What is he talking about? Chen set her teacup down with a soft, deliberate clack. She looked at Veilen, and for the first time, a look of genuine respect flickered across her weathered face. You're the analyst, she said softly, the one who flagged our negotiation timestamps. I am, Veilen said. And I know your ships aren't freighters, Admiral. I know your ships aren't freighters, Admiral. I know what your contractors have been doing for the last year during their maintenance shifts, but there is one thing I still don't understand. Chen raised an eyebrow. Ask it. Veilen took a step toward the table. Why did you leave 412 vessels in our docking bays? Why hand over your prime activation keys at all if you had 42,000 ships hidden in plain sight? Chen smiled. It was the same smile Vance had given on the plinth a year ago, tired, patient, and infinitely deep. Because, Overseer, Chen said, a key doesn't just turn a lock off. It turns it back on. She stood up, smoothing the front of her uniform. The 412 Vanguard cruisers in your orbital bays are the command and control hubs for the entire Aegis 10 network, she explained, her voice taking on the sharp, resonant cadence of a commander on her own bridge. When we surrendered them, we handed you inert hulls. But the quantum-entangled relays inside those hulls are still linked to the Oort Cloud salvage containers. They are linked to the automated arming pods floating in deep space. She leaned over the table, placing her palms flat on the dark glass. We don't need 6 days to assemble a fleet, Secretary General. Our fleet is already there. It's been sitting next to your trade stations, your refueling depots, and your planetary relay hubs for 14 months. Every human freighter in this sector is currently parked 4 minutes away from a hidden weapons pod. Orth Moss gasped, his mouth opening and closing uselessly. You maintained a rogue military force inside our borders. No, Chen corrected sharply. We maintained a civilian logistics network that is fully compliant with Resolution 9 Omega. Every ship is registered. Every crew member has valid civilian papers. We haven't violated a single law, you wrote. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small glass data chip, and slid it across the table to Orth Moss. That is a standard Conclave commercial emergency requisition contract, she said. Under subclause 8F of your own trade charter, the High Logistics Overseer has the authority to temporarily hire civilian shipping fleets to perform emergency, security, and transport operations during an unprovoked external crisis. She looked at Veilen. If your Overseer signs that contract, our freighters will dock with our salvage pods. We will mount our industrial mining equipment onto our cargo bays, and we will clear your border in 6 hours. Orth Moss stared at the chip as if it were a venomous predator. And if I refuse, if I order your ships seized for deception, Chen's eyes went cold. Then the Kraken will harvest your homeworlds while you read us your legal briefs, she said softly. And when they finally come for Sol, humanity will fight them alone over our own skies, the way we always expected to. Silence hung thick in the bunker. The glowing tactical map flickered red, marking the steady, relentless advance of 80 Kraken dreadnoughts toward the central relay. Orthmos looked at the alien commanders around him. None met his gaze. He looked at Veilen. Veilen didn't hesitate. He pulled his personal stylus from his belt, walked to the table, and pressed his master seal onto the glass chip. "Requisition approved, Admiral," Veilen said. "Get your ships." The Kraken Vanguard fleet exited warp at the central spur relay, expecting a slaughter. Their sensors had scanned the system 3 light minutes out. They had detected no conclave warships, no active defense grids, no energy signatures consistent with military mobilization. There were only the massive, sprawling metal structures of the trade hub, surrounded by thousands of clumsy, lumbering civilian freighters. The fat, defenseless sheep of a soft galactic empire. The Kraken flagship, the Iron Teeth, broadcast a localized jammer signal, locking down all long-range communications. Their weapon bays slid open, plasma lances charging to incinerate the orbital docks. Then, space began to bend. It did not bend with the violent flash of warships jumping out of hyperspace. It bent locally, right in the middle of the civilian trade formations. Across 30 square light seconds, thousands of innocent-looking Terran Apex-class freighters shifted their positioning. They didn't scatter. They didn't flee in frantic, disorganized vectors. They executed a perfectly synchronized, pre-calculated fleet movement. A geometric net that swept around the 80 Kraken dreadnoughts in a three-dimensional sphere. In the docking bays of the Conclave station below, the 412 surrendered Vanguard cruisers hummed to life. Their power cores, kept warm and fully fueled for 14 months under the guise of maintenance diagnostics, surged to 100% capacity. Their quantum arrays lit up, beaming high-bandwidth activation signals into the surrounding void. Out in the dark, floating inside innocuous, unmarked cargo containers that had been towed into the sector weeks ago by mining tugs, automated magnetic locks blew open. Heavy, dual-barreled railgun turrets, high-yield plasma lances, and automated missile pods slid out of their pressurized housings. Driven by low-emission cold gas thrusters, the weapons drifted toward the waiting Apex freighters. On board the freighters, human crews, veterans who had practiced this exact protocol in simulators for 2 years, rolled back the composite civilian side panels of their hulls. Heavy magnetic locks snapped out, grabbing the incoming weapon pods with brutal mechanical precision. Power cables clicked into place. Targeting feeds integrated seamlessly into the ship's auxiliary networks. Their assembly time was 3 minutes and 42 seconds. On the bridge of the Iron Teeth, the Kraken Supreme Commander watched his tactical sensors turn from a serene field of blue trade icons into an absolute wall of red military signatures, 42,000 heavy warships. Not 42,000 scattered vessels, but a fully integrated, overlapping kill grid, perfectly pre-positioned to lock every single Kraken dreadnought in a multi-vector firing solution. The human fleet did not broadcast a demand for surrender. They did not initiate diplomatic hailing channels. A single signal bounced from the lead Terran cruiser across the entire local network. A simple 3-word automated command, broadcast on all military bands. Pattern Delta. Execute. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. 42,000 heavy railguns fired simultaneously. The void between the ships turned into a solid lattice of white-hot tungsten slugs moving at .05 light speed. The Kraken dreadnought's heavy kinetic shields flashed violently, held for 2 seconds under the unprecedented kinetic density, and then shattered like thin glass. Plasma lances carved through the brutalist armor of the alien flagships. Missile pods, packed with high-yield nuclear warheads that had been legally classified as asteroid demolition charges 4 hours prior, detonated inside the Kraken engine blocks. The Kraken Vanguard. 80 of the most formidable war vessels in the Outer Rim was reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas and drifting metal scrap in 6 minutes and 12 seconds. Not a single human ship was lost. Not a single Conclave civilian was harmed. 3 days later, the Citadel was silent. The Kraken main fleet, receiving the terrifying sensor logs from their obliterated vanguard, had halted their advance into the Orion Spur. Long-range reconnaissance showed their remaining forces executing a complete, hurried retreat back into the deep void beyond the Perseus Arm. Rational actors, when confronted with a military force that logically should not exist, do not fight. They recalculate. The Grand Assembly had convened an extraordinary session to process what had happened, but the grand speeches had been cancelled. The victory parades were quietly shelved. High Overseer Veilen stood in the observation gallery, looking down at the empty plinth where Jonathan Vance had laid humanity's master key a year ago. Beside him, analyst Cora was reviewing an old document she had pulled from the deepest levels of the Valari Historical Archive, a document dated 40 years prior, written by a low-level intelligence analyst when humanity first requested trade access. "Listen to this," Cora whispered, reading from her pad recommendation. "Treat any human concession or compliance as instrumental. The primary strategic threat of humanity is not their technological development or their fleet capacity. It is their demonstrated cultural capacity to endure immense individual and collective humiliation in service of long-term strategic objectives that are unreadable to outside observers. Note, they do not view defeat as a status. They view defeat as a tactical phase. We filed that under secondary strategic notes," Veilen said softly. "For 40 years. They saved us, Overseer," Cora said, looking out the glass window at the departure trails of the Terran freighters. The ships were already shedding their weapon pods back into storage containers, reattaching their civilian hull panels and resuming their trade routes as if nothing had happened. They saved the entire conclave. "They did," Veilen agreed. "And do you know what the terrifying part is, Cora?" "What? They didn't do it because they love us," Veilen said, his crest slowly flattening in profound humility. "They did it because they looked at our 4,000-year-old empire, saw how fragile and arrogant we were, and decided that someone had to be the adult in the room. They accepted our insults, endured our disarmament treaties, and let us feel powerful for a year. Just so we would still be here when the dark came." He turned away from the glass and began walking toward his office. "Where are you going, Overseer?" Cora called after him. "To draft a new proposal for the Assembly," Veilen replied without stopping. "I am going to recommend that we burn Resolution 9 Omega, and then I am going to recommend that we ask the humans, very politely, if they would be willing to teach us how to wait."